What if a place could take more than just your memory of it, but every trace that you were ever there at all? All. Deep in the woods outside a small mountain town sits an old hunting cabin that locals stopped visiting decades ago. Not because of a fire, or a flood, or a collapse. Because everyone who spent a night inside, it came back changed, missing something no one could quite name, and no one could ever get back. Tonight, you'll hear the full story of the cabin that erased every visitor. A case file that 4 different park rangers refused to close, and one family is still trying to understand. Stay until the end, because the final visitor's account changes everything. This is a fictional story, inspired by classic wilderness folklore. Get comfortable, and let's begin. In the fall of 1979, a hiking group of 4 college students set out to spend a weekend at an old hunting cabin nestled deep in the Culver Mountains, a property that had belonged to a reclusive trapper decades earlier and had since been left to the state. By the time they hiked back out on Sunday, only 3 of them remembered there had ever been a 4th. His name was Gary Pruitt. His car was still parked at the trailhead. His hiking gear was still folded in the cabin's second bedroom. But when rangers questioned the remaining 3 students, none of them could describe his face, recall a single conversation with him, or explain why his belongings were mixed in with theirs. It wasn't that they'd forgotten him the way you forget a stranger. They insisted, uneasily, that something about remembering him properly felt physically difficult, like trying to recall a dream that kept sliding out of reach the harder they focused on it. Gary Pruitt's family reported him missing. Search parties combed the surrounding woods for 2 weeks. They found no trace of him anywhere except the belongings he'd left behind in the cabin his own. Friends could barely remember him entering. Park Ranger Denise Whitcomb was assigned to monitor the cabin after Gary Pruitt's disappearance, largely because no other visitors had reported anything unusual in the property's 40 years of use before that weekend. She began keeping a private log, separate from her official reports, after her second visit to the site. On her first visit, she noted nothing unusual beyond the cabin's age and a slightly colder than expected interior. On her second visit, 3 days later, she wrote that she couldn't remember climbing the porch steps, despite having no memory of any gap in her day, and despite her own truck's odometer showing several more miles driven than her route should have required. She began timing her visits and writing down details immediately upon entering, specifically to test whether her memory held steady inside the cabin. It didn't. Small details slipped first: what she'd eaten for breakfast, what shirt she'd put on that morning, whether she'd locked her truck. By her 4th visit, she wrote a single line before leaving that she later couldn't explain writing. "I don't think it takes what you remember. I think it takes proof that you were ever here to remember it." Whitcomb eventually found something tucked behind a warped floorboard in the cabin's main room, a visitor ledger, apparently kept by the original trapper who'd built the cabin decades earlier, listing names, dates, and short notes for every guest who had stayed there since the 1930s. Most entries were mundane: hunting trip dates, weather notes, minor repairs. But scattered throughout, roughly one every few years, was a name crossed out entirely. The ink scratched through so hard it had torn the page, with a single word written beside it each time: gone. Whitcomb cross-referenced 3 of the crossed-out names against county records. All 3 matched real people who had, at some point, been reported missing in the surrounding area, decades apart, with no connection to each other beyond having stayed at the cabin. None of the disappearances had ever been linked to the property before. Families had moved away. Records had aged out of active investigation. The pattern had simply never been noticed because no single person had stayed to notice it. Whitcomb was the first. In 1994, 15 years after Gary Pruitt vanished, a hunter named Roy Castellan requested permission to use the cabin during rifle season, unaware of its history. Whitcomb, by then a senior ranger, allowed it, but insisted on checking in with him by radio every 6 hours, a precaution she never fully explained to her supervisors. Castellan's first 2 check-ins were normal. On the third, his voice sounded distant and slightly confused. He asked Whitcomb seriously whether he'd radioed him before, insisting he had no memory of the previous check-in, despite the log clearly recording it. By the 4th check-in, Castellan didn't respond at all. Whitcomb hiked in herself and found him sitting on the cabin's porch, physically unharmed, but deeply disoriented. He could describe, in reasonable detail, arriving at the cabin and unpacking his gear. He could not describe a single moment of the following 2 days, despite his supply packs showing clear evidence he'd eaten, slept, and moved around the cabin extensively during that time. Castellan left the mountain that same day and never returned. He later told Whitcomb, in a follow-up call she noted carefully in her private log, that he sometimes still felt like part of those 2 missing days was still happening somewhere, just out of reach of his memory. Whitcomb spent years trying to trace the cabin's original owner, a trapper named Elias Vane, who had built the structure sometime in the early 1930s and had, according to county death records, died alone on the property in 1958. She eventually located a final journal, water-damaged but partially legible, in a county historical archive that had acquired several of Vane's belongings after his death. Vane wrote that he built the cabin over what he called a thin patch in the woods, a spot he claimed local trappers before him had always avoided, describing it only as a place where the forest seemed to double back on itself if you stayed too long without leaving a clear trail of your presence. His final entries grew increasingly fragmented, describing guests he could no longer remember inviting him belongings in the cabin he didn't recognize as his own, despite having lived there for decades. His very last entry, barely legible, read, "I have started keeping the ledger not to remember them. I keep it so something does." Vane's body was found in the cabin in 1958. County records listed his death as being from natural causes, though the report also noted, almost as an afterthought, that investigators at the time couldn't determine exactly how long he had been deceased before being found, despite the cabin showing clear signs of regular daily use in the days immediately prior. In 2003, Whitcomb finally convinced the state to formally close the cabin to visitors and seal the property, citing structural safety concerns rather than the real reason in her official recommendation. Before the cabin was boarded up, she made one final visit, this time bringing a portable audio recorder to document her observations aloud in real time in case her written notes proved unreliable again. The recording, later transcribed by a colleague after Whitcomb herself couldn't fully recall what she'd said, captured her narrating a normal walkthrough for the first 11 minutes. In the 12th minute, her voice changed pace, slower and more deliberate, as she read aloud from the trapper's old ledger, adding a final entry in her own hand, her own name, the date, and a short note. The note read only, "Denise Whitcomb, still here. Writing this down so someone believes it." She has no memory of writing that entry, despite it being confirmed by handwriting analysis to be unmistakably hers. The cabin remains sealed to this day. Whitcomb retired from the Park Service 2 years later, and according to former colleagues, has never returned to that section of the mountain since. To this day, no one has ever fully explained why every documented visitor to that cabin lost some piece of their own memory, or why the only thing that ever seemed to survive the experience was the ledger itself. Was it some strange property of the land the cabin was built on? exactly as Elias Vane believed? Was it something about the isolation, distorting memory the same way extreme cold distorts the body? Or does some part of every visitor really still remain there, waiting the same way Denise Whitcomb's final entry suggests? Sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries aren't about what a place does to the people who enter it. They're about what it manages to make everyone else forget. If you enjoyed this original mystery story, like the video, subscribe for more, and turn on notifications for future psychological thrillers, unsolved mysteries, and fictional true crime-inspired tales. Until next time, sleep carefully.